All right, everybody. Needed to talk a little bit about buying life insurance and some tips here. This is a longer chapter. We're only going to go over a few things that are in here. But there's some important things that I wanted to make sure that you understand about buying life insurance. Really, it comes down to taxation. There's a couple key things that I want you to remember here. And then there's just some basic tips that we should be thinking about when you're shopping for life insurance. So a reminder, we talked about this before, the death benefit is generally tax-free to the beneficiary. And that's a big deal. There are not very many ways that you can have a transfer of lots of money from one person to another that don't have tax associated with that. If it's more than, right now the limit's $14,000 a year. If you give more than that to somebody, there's a gift tax and it's 33%. It's big. So if you had a huge amount of money that you were trying to give to somebody, this happens all the time. Parents want to transfer their wealth to their children. There's a cap on what you can do before you have to start paying some fairly significant taxes. So generally, that's a strategy over time. You're trying to do that, where you're giving $14,000, $15,000 a year per child if you're talking about a large estate and you're trying to transfer that. Yeah, I know. That's first world problems, right? But it is a problem to transfer a large amount of money from one person to another. There's usually tax involved one way or the other. With life insurance, there isn't. You could leave $1 million death benefit to somebody, and that would be tax-free to them. So what you don't want to do is leave it to your estate, because if you leave it to your estate, the potential is that it might be subject to estate taxes. And combined federal and state, that can be over 50%. So you lose half of it to taxes. That's a big mistake to make. You want to have beneficiaries named. One other place where it's taxable is if you have a corporation as a beneficiary. That's unusual, but that's worth mentioning. So anyway, death benefits are supposed to be tax-free to the beneficiary. And most of the time they will be. That's something that's important to keep in mind. Your cash value, you've got a permanent life insurance policy. Your cash value is growing from year to year. The cash value is growing tax-free. So it's a little bit like if you have a retirement account. From year to year, as you're gaining assets in that retirement account, you're not paying taxes every year on the gains. And that's an advantage. This is why some people think that permanent life insurance is an advantageous way to invest, because you're not paying taxes all the way up like you would in a standard investment account. You're going to pay taxes on the interest at ordinary income tax rates, and then any gains that you have, anytime you sell, you have to pay capital gains taxes, which those rates tend to be lower than ordinary income tax rates, but it's still a tax. You've got none of that if it's sheltered within a life insurance policy. And so that's why some people think that's an advantageous way to invest. It really does duplicate a lot of the advantages that a retirement account has. And most people have additional advantages that they get from investing in retirement accounts. So that's why we say do that first. There's a small group of people who can benefit from the fact that cash value is growing tax-free is a good thing for investing. But that's generally people who have maxed out all their other options. And most people could stand to save a little bit more for retirement. So we say don't do this. If you're thinking about investing, don't use life insurance, use investments. That's for the average person, that's the strategy. If you surrender your life insurance policy, what we're going to do is we're going to see how much is it worth, and we're going to compare it to how much you paid. If it's worth more than you paid, then that is taxed as ordinary income. If it is not worth more than you paid, then you haven't had a gain and you won't pay taxes on that. So when you surrender a policy, that's a taxable event, potentially, if your cash value gains have made up for the difference in the amount of premiums that you've paid. Then dividends are also going to be tax-free. So basically everything is tax-free within a life insurance policy except when you surrender. And then at that point, the amount by which you have exceeded what you've paid, that difference is taxable. So if you've made money on the deal, it's taxable. If you haven't, if you've paid more money and you've cashed out less than what you paid in, then there's no taxes involved there. So that's kind of how the taxation of life insurance works. Here's the big thing, is the estate tax. And it's got more of a history than I was able to put on the slide. When I started teaching, this was something that I spent time showing what happened, because we had a really significant event in 2010. And I know now it seems like a long time ago. But this was in the middle of right when I was teaching for the first time. So this was really kind of critical to see. So the federal estate tax was in this 45% category. If you had, now there was always an exemption over if you had more than $1.5 million in assets. And you might say, oh, well, this doesn't affect hardly anybody then. I mean, who's got $1.5 million in assets? Small business owners. That's the big problem there, because their estate is typically not liquid. They have business assets, you got buildings, you got inventory, and all of a sudden, if you die, that's considered part of your estate, and somehow you have to pay the taxes on the value. Well, you don't have the cash to do that, so you either have to go and take out a loan from the bank to keep operating to pay your estate tax, or more commonly, you get forced into selling. And so this was a big problem. For life insurance, where it's a big deal is this is going to add to that problem. So all of a sudden you say, nobody's got $1.5 million in assets. No, you're right. That's rare. Except when we factor in life insurance. $1 million in life insurance is pretty common. So if you leave that to your estate and your estate has other assets in it, now you're reaching a point where you might have to worry about owing estate taxes, and it's near 50%. It's a big deal. Again, how do you get around that? Leave your life insurance to a beneficiary, and then it's tax-free. That's why it's so important to do it that way. You don't want your estate to be the beneficiary. How would that happen? You don't have any beneficiaries named. Then it's your estate. That's how it goes. Or if you chose to name your estate as beneficiary, you could do that. But again, for all the reasons that I've just said, that's generally a bad idea. So, okay, we had roughly a 50% estate tax. Then in 2010, it was going to be repealed for 1 year. So this was a deal they struck in the early 2000s in Congress. And the thought was, well, we got 10 years, we'll fix it. Before that comes around, we'll decide whether or not we want to have a state tax or not. So you got two sides, and they're always fighting, right? So on the estate tax, why do we do that? Why do we tax people after they die? I mean, we taxed them the whole way while they were living. Why should we tax them again at death? That's one side's argument, and you can see how that makes sense. You say, well, yeah, that's going to be a complicated thing because it happens at an unexpected time. And now you're going to assess a huge tax penalty on a family when they're really not ready to deal with all this. So maybe that's not a good thing to do. Maybe we shouldn't have an estate tax. There's a pretty big group that says that. The other side of it is if you don't have an estate tax, what ends up happening over time is that wealth concentrates among certain families. And in generally, we don't want to have a situation where 20 wealthy families control half of the wealth of the country. And that's the fear. If you don't have an estate tax, maybe that's what will end up happening. And for society, we generally don't think that that's a great thing. So you got those two sides fighting against each other, and they always have been, and they always will be. And my point isn't to try to get you to take sides. My point is to try to get you to understand that's where the conflict is. So we've always had this problem of should we have an estate tax, should we not? As it stands today, yes, we have an estate tax, but the exemption levels are much, much higher. Now we're up to about $5 million for an individual, and it gets doubled if you're a couple. And then on top of that, you can always leave any amount to your spouse tax-free. So at least you can avoid it for one death. And then beyond that, you've got to do some estate tax planning. Here's the thing. One of the reasons that big amounts of life insurance are popular among certain groups is to pay the estate taxes. So who wants the estate tax to stick around? Well, the people who make their money selling big amounts of life insurance, they kind of have an incentive to hope that the estate tax sticks around because that's a big source of business for them. You do away with the estate tax and all of a sudden there's no need for some people to have these big amounts of life insurance. So it's interesting what happens with incentives here, and you can imagine how that explodes. And all of a sudden you've got lobbyists, trying to make arguments to different Congress people, trying to get them on one side of the argument or the other, because this has really big implications for certain people. Forget about the people who are paying the tax. There's other people who are involved here too, who have an interest in whether or not we maintain the estate tax. I didn't mean to go on so long. With regard to life insurance, the issue is this. You don't want your estate to be the beneficiary, because if it is, it could push you into a place where estate taxes are now liable. where if you'd have left your life insurance to a regular person, that's a tax-free event. That's really all we need to be thinking about with regard to life insurance, but it's a big issue. All right, so when the time comes for you to shop for life insurance, what do I think you should be thinking about? Well, it's got to follow the need. So what type of insurance should you buy? Term insurance or permanent insurance? Well, is your need temporary or is it permanent? Remember, term insurance only works for temporary needs because eventually term insurance expires and you can renew, but at some age you can't afford to do it anymore. So if you have a permanent need, you can't use term insurance to meet that need. And most people will have a little bit of both. That's normal. So it's not like it's one or the other and you can only have one or the other. But you do need to determine, do you have permanent needs or temporary needs? And then you match that with the type of life insurance you buy. Permanent insurance is a lot more expensive because we're guaranteeing you will get a death benefit payment. Term insurance, most people don't. 98% of people survive to the end of the term, which means that very few people end up collecting on their term policy, which means that term policies should be cheap, and they are. We're going to investigate that a little bit more in the term quote assignment that we're going to have you do really soon. If you care about dividends, you'll want to make sure you get a participating policy. And then you're participating along with the life insurance company. If they have favorable mortality, favorable expenses, or favorable investments, remember those are the only three places where we can generate profits in life insurance. If they're lucky in those three directions, then you'll qualify for additional dividends. If that's important to you, well, you want to make sure you get a policy that offers that feature. Huge variation in cost, just like you see with auto insurance, just like you see with homeowners insurance, but even more with life insurance because people generally don't shop. Remember, life insurance, we say it's really not bought, it's sold. And because of that, usually you don't buy it until somebody you know who sells it approaches you. And at that point, you're not really thinking about shopping around. It's just a yes or no based on what your acquaintance is telling you about what they have to offer. So that's usually a mistake. It makes sense to shop around. You should know about how much life insurance costs. Spoiler alert, term insurance for a young, healthy person is really quite affordable. And if you have dependents, I think you have to consider that you probably have a moral responsibility to think about what would happen if your income stopped. What position would that leave them in? If you're healthy and you're young, it's a really easy thing to do, and it's a really inexpensive thing to do. Gets more complicated if your health is more complicated. But it's worth considering regardless if you have dependents. Now, if you don't have dependents, I realize most of the people in this class probably don't. And so, yeah, for most of the people in this class, life insurance should not be on your radar right now. When you have dependents, that changes 180 degrees. So we just want you thinking about that. You want to think about the financial rating of the insurance company that's backing the policy, right? Because this is a long-term thing. I mean, this might be a 10, 20, 30-year contract that you're signing. You're going to be paying premiums for that period of time. What if that insurance company goes bankrupt? Whoa, all of a sudden your life insurance policy is no good. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. How do we make sure that doesn't happen? Well, we don't expect you to examine the finances of an insurance company and know whether this is solid or not. So we have a company that does that for us. AM Best rates insurance companies on financial strengths. And they do that on the basis of the grading system that you're familiar with seeing in school. It's pretty close to that, except we have A++, and then we have A+, and then we have A, and then we have B++, and so on. You want to stay in the A range. Those are companies that this company, AM Best, has said, yeah, they'll be able to meet their financial obligations. You get lower than that, now there's a question. And you'll see a price differential too. So just because you find the cheapest one, hey, just double check on those financial strength ratings and make sure that's not why. We do know that the stronger companies are able to charge more for life insurance, and they're able to do it by saying, look, you don't have to worry about whether or not we're going to pay our bills. We'll be able to pay the claims that come. Lower rated companies, it's not a guarantee. So that's something that's worth thinking about too. And then finally, I think you need an agent. It is possible to buy life insurance over the internet, but the number of people who are really qualified to assess their own financial needs and do so accurately Yeah, that's a small group. It's really helpful to have a third party, even if you are financially savvy. Even someone like myself, I feel like, yeah, I should be able to buy my own life insurance. I still benefited from having an agent because they were able to raise a couple things that, yeah, I understood. It wasn't lack of understanding, but it maybe was lack of a realization that, wow, this actually could be really important to me. And it's always better to have a third party help you out. And especially if you're talking about term insurance, it's not like you're paying a huge amount of money for the benefit to have an agent. And I generally think that having the agent's expertise, that's worth it. That's an opinion. But I really do think unless you are really, really, really sharp with this stuff, you can probably benefit from having a life insurance agent help you out with some of your needs. Next chapter is going to talk about annuities and IRAs in particular. And there's an exercise that I want to run through before we do any of this. But I'm already at 16 minutes here and I can't finish that up in 5 minutes. So I'm going to take a pause here and then we'll start with the next lecture with that exercise that I think is valuable when we start to shift our idea towards retirement. Annuities are a strategy that we use in retirement, life annuities anyway. And again, this is something that I'm guessing most of you don't have a lot of familiarity with. If you've dealt with annuities, that's just a stream of payments, but you've dealt with fixed annuities. I want to buy a car over 6 years, and I don't want to spend more than $10,000. How much is my payment going to be at 5% interest? That's an annuity problem, but it's a fixed period annuity. And those are easy. Life annuities, the pricing is a lot harder because you have an unknown variable that's plugged in there. They're going to pay me for the rest of my life. How long is that going to be? We don't know. If you knew that it was going to be 20 years, then it's a fixed period annuity and it's easy and you can do it. But we don't know. That's the problem. So we'll get into that next chapter, and the need for a life annuity comes up when a person stops working. So it's a retirement topic. And that's the framework that we're going to use to talk about all these things in the next lecture. Okay, I'll stop it there. Thanks a lot, you guys. We'll go from there.